Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Rare Japanese Sounds. And today I'm thrilled to be joining you all on a new entry to the series, A Collector's Guide. The previous one, which was dedicated to Hiroshi Yoshimura, if you haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to do so. But since it got a lot of feedback, a lot of good feedback, I decided to make another one. And this time we're going to be looking at a specific label of ambient new age music that has a pretty interesting history and that is quite small, so it's going to be a great topic for, a small, nice video to look at the different entries of the label, the well-known ones, the not as well-known ones, and probably you might learn a thing or two, so let's get into it. So what's the Misawa Home label, which is what we're going to look into today? Basically, the Misawa Home label was a very short-lived label. It was created in 1986 and stopped releasing albums in 1989. It was only comprised of 5 albums in total. So as you can see, it was a pretty small label, both in terms of lifespan and just number of titles in it. But what's really interesting about the label is that it was created and produced by the Misawa Homes company, which you might or not have heard of, because it's a company that builds and sells pre-made homes, basically. And because that company is quite a big company, it's quite well known in Japan, it had all sorts of research going on various subjects. And one of them was sound design. They had a whole laboratory dedicated to that kind of research on pretty, fields that surround the idea of what a home is, what the interior is, and how you can complement the interior with all kinds of things. And the sound was one of the things they decided to work on. So to that effect, they contracted a few artists and asked them to make albums that would go into that notion of sound design. And first, the two first albums on that label had the subtitle Soundscape, which can make you imagine what idea the Misawa Homes company had in mind for that label. And of course, which you can see by the album next to me, the first entry on that label, on that series Soundscape, was, Surround, which I probably don't need to introduce to any of you who are familiar with the field of ambient music, but for those of you who aren't too much into that whole ambient new age Japanese music thing, basically the Surround label is made by an artist that at the time was not very well known by the public, but was already kind of a known figure in the world of making ambient music, making environmental music in particular, and the field of sound design. So it was a pretty straight idea by the Misawa Home label to hire someone like Hiroshi Yoshimura to make the first album on that series. And Surround really captures that idea of what soundscape is, what should interior sound design be, especially because at the time the Misawa Home company was focusing a lot on making homes that were, that had a certain cachet to them, that had a certain price range. It wasn't for anybody. And those who could afford those houses might have a bit more expectations in terms of what they're going to put into their home. Anyway, Surround being the first entry into the Misawa Home label, it did actually get the full suite of both the LP, the CD, and the cassette album. Of course, we already talked about the album itself in the Yoshimura Collector's Guide, but to put it simply, here the CD is much more common than the LP for some reason, and the cassette is incredibly rare. So usually in those collector's guides, I give a few figures about some statistics about the album. And for this one, you have only 10 or so copies of the album that were sold on Yahoo auctions since 2015, and the current going price seems to be about 50,000 yen or $500. Whereas for the CD, you're looking at 4 times the amount of copies sold, around 40. And the price it seems to be going for is something along the lines of 10,000 yen. So you can see there is a pretty big discrepancy in terms of price, and that's usually what you notice in those very well-known albums. And given the scarcity of the LP, it makes the price go up even more because you have a bottleneck of supply. And with all the demand that is out there, even if the demand is not that high for an album that is, this expensive, $500 is not common for any LP, it makes the price be sustained. And to give you an idea, 10 in 5 years means that if you want this album, you need to on average wait 6 months for one to be listed on an auction website. That's a very long amount of time compared to most other albums. Surround also has the particularity of being Yoshimura's only album that I would truly qualify as ambient, because it's by far the album with the smallest amount of action going on. It's very, very calm, and it's the one that I would definitely feel that it would be the most appropriate for an interior environment. Of course, all of Yoshimura's albums are good in their own right, but this one has really this link between what it's supposed to represent and the music going on. So it's really a unique factor, and I definitely expect the price of the LP to never go down ever. Even if there is a reissue going on, which, let's be honest, is probably going to come given Light in the Attic's recent reissue of Green, which is actually going out probably at the same time that this video will be released. Anyway, a few words about the cassette release in particular, which I actually don't have any picture to show off because it's just that rare, never sold on auction. And of course, that's probably linked to the fact that cassette tapes are much harder to list on auction websites, because people probably don't care about their cassette collection. People who own cassette didn't have the same definitely wasn't the same type of customers that purchased the LP, the CD, and the cassette, especially in 1986 when this album was released. The LP, it was probably the basic consumer, the one with the certain setup, being able to play the record. The CDs was more the audiophile portion of the population, those who had a CD player, which was extremely expensive back in the day. Back in 1986, CDs were only a thing as of 1984, I think. So when you have, on one hand, the normal consumer buying the LP, which I don't know why it was so much rarer than the CD, but the more audiophile and more experienced portion of the population getting the CD, then who gets the cassette tape? Especially for that kind of album. The cassette tape was something you were listening to on the go, something you didn't want to listen to at home because of the lesser sound quality compared to the CD, of course, but even the LP. So you have, because of the availability of the other formats, you have not many people interested in buying a cassette for this type of album. That's why it's so rare, and I don't have any idea of what the price would be, but a good estimate would probably be around 25,000 yen. That's what I would pay if someone was trying to sell it to me. Okay, that's for Surround, but of course you also have the second entry in the Soundscape series, which has been reissued very recently. It's of course Nova, which you might have seen if you follow me on Instagram. I posted it earlier this week. And this one is already much more common to find than Surround, for a reason that I don't really understand, but it does have at least 30 or so listings for the LP, and this time it's the CD, which is rarer. I could only find less than about a dozen copies sold since 2015. The price discrepancy also is much lesser between the two, with the LP going for maybe 10,000 or a bit more if you're looking for a very clean copy, and the CD going for about 5,000 if you're looking for something with the OB in a good condition, etc. And actually for this one, there was a cassette tape copy that got sold, I think, in 2019, and it was gone for only 6,000 yen, which I thought was pretty cheap. But this has the particularity of being reissued, and it has been reissued in 2019 by Release Whatever We Want Records. And it was not only reissued, it was reissued as a double LP with a lot of extra tracks, which makes the reissue much more appealing. Like you get an extra LP to listen to bonus tracks that weren't on the original release. Of course, they also have this tendency to release not only the regular LP but also test pressing copy signed by the artist, which also is appealing to a certain type of collector. So you have a lot of people who, instead of buying the original, could find more value in the other versions, even the CD. Why buy the original when you could get the new version with extra tracks? Even the cassette tape reissue, which was limited to 100 copies, I think, this one had an additional bonus track that wasn't on the other versions of the reissue. So you really have a bit for everyone, and I think that's good on the part of the company that reissued this album, because it does create more value for the reissue, and that's really what I want every reissue copy to have. I'm not really a big fan of these reissues who just try to mimic the original as much as possible. I think it's just trying to surf on the popularity of the original, whereas you could do some much cooler things like, of course, a remaster. That's the most basic thing to do when you reissue something. But putting extra tracks, putting extra inserts, those are the things that I think we should see on any good reissue, and I really commend WRT, etc. for doing this on this version. Now, as for the collectible value, well, I will always recommend getting the original, because you can only have one original, but who knows how many times they're going to make a reissue of it. That's why I would always try to, look around the market. Of course, if you find a good deal for the reissue, just go ahead, do what makes more sense to you. If you're just someone who wants to listen to the music and can't be bothered to find a copy that's actually in your mint, don't want any noise on your copy, you can just buy a reissue and be assured of that. But as far as I'm seeing on Discogs, there are a lot of copies available of the standard double LP reissue, so keep that in mind. Even the original is not very hard to find at any given moment. Now, a version that I should be talking about when mentioning Nova is that there exists a version of that album with not the standard sleeve. Well, it does have the standard sleeve, but it also has an outer sleeve that is basically saying something like sound interior. It's much harder to find than this version, and I'm not exactly sure in what ways they were distributed. Was it always distributed with this sound interior outer sleeve? And you probably are seeing the image on the corner of the screen, so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. So if you find that copy in particular with the extra outer sleeve, should you buy it rather than this one? Again, depends on your personal preference. You should always try to keep in mind how much of a premium you're paying and for what. For instance, should you pay a 33% premium just to get the OB on your LP? Well, probably not. But again, it depends on what type of collector you are, because it's much easier to find someone wanting to buy your album complete with all the inserts and OB, as opposed to someone who just wants, a copy for as cheap as possible. So it's that dichotomy between types of collectors. In doubt, if you're spending a lot of money, you might as well spend the maximum amount of money and get the best version you can. It's the version that will keep its value with the highest likelihood. Now, those two albums are by far the better known albums on the Misawa home label. But, and that might surprise some of you, there was actually a third entry to the Soundscape series. And that album is something that was called Daydreamin by an artist called K2, which was K2 because of the names of the two pianists that were asked to do this album. And this one has a pretty interesting difference with the two previous ones. And the difference is that, unlike Nova and Surround, which both got a cassette tape version, an LP version, a CD version, those later albums on the Misawa home label only got a CD version, probably because the two first ones didn't sell very well, and you can see that by just the low number of sales on Yahoo auctions. Not many people were interested in that kind of albums back then. Even now, the people who know about ambient music, in particular Japanese environmental music, that's still a very small subset of the population. And you can't really blame them. And you see a very distinct shift between the two first albums, which were very experimental, very unique, and which had a lot of musical value. And you see Misawa Home going from that idea of sound interior, of sound design for the interior of our homes, to something that is much less risky, because Daydreamin is an album that is only piano solo. Now, don't get me wrong, the quality of the composition and the tracks themselves, they're all very good, at least to me they are. But you don't get the same kind of originality that you got with the two first entries on the Misawa Home label. Now, something to mention is that this Daydreaming album actually has two versions. The first one, and you can see the cover very well because I put the LB on the plastic case. You might know that for Japanese CDs, the LB tends to get loose very easily. So if you don't have a good way to put it, you can just put it in front of the cover, just to know that you have it and that you won't lose it. But this one wasn't released by Misawa Home themselves. It was actually released by the Crown label, which you can see here at the bottom. I need to cover my head. And it's the only album of the whole series to do that. Now, why? I have absolutely no idea. Maybe the artists were already under contract from the Crown label, and that's why they had to make a version on that label. But what's really strange to me is that not only does this version exist, there also exists a version on the actual Misawa Home label. And that one is much rarer than the Crown version. The Crown version is already pretty rare, but because the demand is so low, because people just don't know the album. Actually, I had to add the album myself to Discogs because it wasn't referenced on it before. Anyway, the price that you could find the Crown version of the album is probably around 1,000 yen if you just wait for long enough. I think even there is one for less than 1,000 yen available right now if you want. Now, as for the Misawa Home, the version that was actually on the Misawa Home label, it's much harder to tell because I only could find one copy sold since 2015. And who knows how much interest for this album there will be when a new copy pops up. I would say probably a few thousand yen, but those things are extremely dependent on how many buyers are willing to spend, the necessary money to get a copy. Let's say I'm willing to pay up to 10,000 yen, but nobody else is willing to pay more than 2,000. Then I will, win the auction for 2,000. But if someone else is willing to pay 10,000, then the album will end up for 10,000 yen. So you only need one single person to have the same max price as you to, get really the price rising. Anyway, it's a pretty strange album, and of course you will need it if you're interested in the Misawa Home label, or even if you're only interested in the Surround collection. But good luck finding the original Misawa Home CD. Now, after the release of Daydreamin, which definitely didn't sell very well, Misawa Home decided to switch from the Soundscape series to a new series called Melody of the Heart, and of which the first release was Static for Piano, again by Hiroshi Yoshimura. And to be frank, Static follows up on pretty much the same ideas as Daydreamin, which were, of course, piano solo melodies, a very soothing atmosphere, and a very modern classical approach that was pretty popular in Japan around that time in the 80s, inspired, among other things, by Eric Satie, who was very popular for his minimalistic piano music. And to be frank, personally, I really enjoyed the album. I think it's even better than Daydreaming in terms of pure musical value. That's also because you have Satsuki Shibano playing the piano for this album, and she was actually the same pianist as the one on the third entry of the Wave Notation series by Satoshi Ashikawa. And of course, Wave Notation series, of which the first album was Music for 9 Postcards by Hiroshi Yoshimura. So you can see how the two got to know each other, and it's great to see them working on a full album, just the two of them. I think it really worked very well, and I'm glad that they had the opportunity of putting this beautiful music into a single album. And actually, if you read the CD book version of the album, you actually get to know a bit more information about how the album was recorded, how they had a lot of difficulty tuning the piano, and then how they're recording everything once, but they didn't feel very satisfied with the final product in terms of sound quality, in terms of how the piano sounded, and they decided, okay, let's do it one more time, even though it's going to take a while. And at that moment, the sound of the piano suddenly became much better, says Yoshimura in the book, and that's the recording that was used in the end for Static for Piano. So I thought it was a very nice story, and I'm glad to be sharing it with you for this one. In terms of much more down-to-earth pricing and rarity, I think you can easily find 15 copies or so sold from 2015 through until now, and the price seems to be hovering around 3,500 yen, so really pretty cheap for what it is. Now, the CD book version, this one is probably around 10,000 yen, but I should precise that it was not part of the Misawa Home label. It was issued in 2003, so way after that. But I'm only mentioning it for the historic significance and for the nice anecdote I got to tell you. It's also worth noting that Static for Piano, and that was also the case for Nova, had different versions of the obi, so I'm not exactly sure how that happened, if those were later represses, because I think the year was the same on both and for both versions of the obi. But don't be surprised if you find different ways that the obi looks, depending on which version you're looking at. And now for the fifth and last album on the Misawa Home label, at least on this part of the Misawa Home label, because it's worth mentioning again that Misawa Home experimented with different areas of music. And of course, while this Misawa Home more focused on ambient new age music was a thing, there was also another label at the same time that was more focused on very early classical music, especially music from the Middle Ages. And while I'm not an expert on that, of course I'm not even an expert on this particular label, but on the other one I only know of its existence, but it's just to show that they were experimenting with different ideas, and for the label dedicated to ambient and new age music, they decided to end it at their fifth release, which is actually very different from the previous one. And for this one, they took a Chinese artist called Lyu Hongjun or something, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, and they made him compose an album called, which you could translate by the Song of the Earth or the Poem of the Earth. This one features traditional Chinese instruments and is completely different from the previous entries in the series. So I'm not sure exactly how they decided to put it, how they find the relationship with the other albums. But it's an interesting part of the series. If you're collecting all of them, you will of course want that album. The good thing, it's not particularly rare. Again, you can find at least a dozen copies sold since 2015, and the price is pretty reasonable, less than 2,000 yen, I think. Really, I'm just amazed that they went from Surround in 1986 to something completely different only a few years later. And that shows that the identity of a label can change a lot depending on the conditions. And probably they tried something different at the end of the life of the label because they didn't have great sales, which I can understand. They were catering to a very specific audience. The economic situation in Japan was on the downtrend, to say the least, at the end of the 80s. After the economic bubble popped, people just didn't have the same kind of money as they used to a few years prior, with the boom of everything in the Japanese music, Japanese economy in general. And of course, music tended to reflect that. That's how you got city pop coming into existence, with a lot of people suddenly having a lot of money, living the city life, but still having that kind of melancholy of things moving so fast and things just got out of hand. And by the end of the 80s right here, you can see that you can feel even the impact of the economic downturn onto what type of music was successful, and definitely having ambient music for the houses of rich people wasn't one of the things that was successful for very long. So it's pretty sad that we didn't get to see more releases on the Misawa home label, but things are what they are. And still you have a collection of 5 albums with a huge evolution between the first and the last. So to me, it's a pretty great label to start collecting all the releases of. I think it's a pretty good exercise if you're trying to collect Japanese music. And of course, while the most expensive album is really expensive, if you try to just collect the CDs, you can easily get all of them with less than $200. You can have your collection of 5 CDs, which is pretty great to me. One last thing I'd like to mention before ending the video, it is that I know there exists some kind of CD set sold by Misawa Home that was composed of 4 CDs of their Misawa Home label. 2 of them were Yoshimura's Surround and Static albums, but the other 2 were actually different albums by different artists that were not part of the 5 ones we've discussed just now. So it definitely makes me wonder how much more exists out there, because those 2 albums were, again, extremely rare. I don't even remember the artist of the album. But what I can assure you is that there are only 5 albums part of the, the C32SD series of releases, and that's what we're covering today. But there are actually a few other Misawa Home releases that supposedly exist, and I will probably make an update to that video when I actually manage to track and find those other releases. But so far, I think we've made a pretty good job at covering what is known, at least pretty well known currently, about the 5 existing releases on the Misawa Home ambient new age series from C32SD1 through 5. And I hope that you find this video instructive. I hope that you've learned a thing or two, and I hope that it makes you want to find out for yourself. Can you find all those releases, even the more difficult ones? Can you find the other ambient albums by Misawa Home that aren't just known to exist yet? I hope that's the kind of spirit you will get from this video. In any case, hope you learned something. This was Rare Japanese Sound. Hope you enjoyed the video. As always, let me know your feedback, and until next time, stay tuned.